A cop takes a bullet. He's bleeding out, his vision fading. But just before the darkness takes him, he sees his loyal K9 partner doing something impossible. When he wakes up in the hospital, the doctors are stunned. He should be dead. But the real shock? His dog is gone. No trace, no explanation. Then a message arrives. If you want to see your dog again, come alone. What did Max do that night? And why is someone trying to bury the truth? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening sun cast long shadows across the police station parking lot as Officer Daniel Smith walked toward his patrol car, his boots clicking against the asphalt. At his side, Max, his German Shepherd partner, moved with the fluid grace that had earned him top honors at the K9 Academy. The dog's alert brown eyes scanned their surroundings, a habit that never failed to make Daniel smile inwardly. "Ready for another shift, buddy?" Daniel's voice was gruff but gentle, a tone reserved only for Max. The dog's tail wagged once in response, and he sat perfectly straight, waiting for Daniel to open the car door. Inside the precinct, newer officers called Daniel the Stone behind his back. He knew this, and he didn't care. 15 years on the force had taught him that keeping people at arm's length was safer, easier. The weight of his badge felt heavy tonight, bringing back memories he'd rather forget. As he settled into the driver's seat, Daniel's mind drifted to that rainy night 3 years ago. His partner, Mike, had been just 2 weeks from retirement. "One last big bust," Mike had said, grinning. "Then it's fishing and grandkids for me." But things had gone wrong. So wrong. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. A wet nose nudged his elbow, pulling him back to the present. Max's concerned eyes met his, filled with an understanding that seemed far too human. Daniel reached over to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I'm okay, boy. Just thinking too much." Max had come into his life 2 years ago when the department insisted he needed a partner. Daniel had resisted at first, but Max wasn't like humans with their endless questions and concerned looks. Max simply understood. He was there in the quiet moments, a steady presence that asked nothing but gave everything. The radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we've got a possible drug deal in progress at the old warehouse on Pine Street. Surveillance only. Do not engage." "Unit 47 responding," Daniel answered, already pulling out of the parking lot. Max sat up straighter, his ears perking forward at the change in his partner's voice. As they drove through the darkening streets, Daniel couldn't shake an unusual feeling of unease. He glanced at Max, surprised to see the dog's hackles slightly raised, something that rarely happened without cause. Max was more than just smart. He had an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it happened. It was one of the many things that made him special. "You feel it too, huh?" Daniel murmured, slowing the car as they approached Pine Street. Max's only response was a low whine, a sound that made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. Something about tonight felt different, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark eyes staring down at them. Daniel parked in a shadowed spot with a clear view of the building's main entrance, settling in for what should have been a routine stakeout. The warehouse stood silent against the night sky, its weathered walls barely visible in the dim streetlights. Daniel killed the engine and turned to Max. "Stay alert, boy." The German Shepherd's ears were already pricked forward, his body tense. A crackle came through the radio. "Unit 47, we've got a distress call from inside the warehouse. Officer needs assistance." Daniel's heart rate picked up. "Unit 47 responding. Come on, Max." They approached the building's side entrance, Daniel's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The metal door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the night breeze. Max's low growl made Daniel pause. Something wasn't right. The silence felt thick, unnatural. "Police! Anyone here?" Daniel's voice echoed through the empty space. No response. They moved deeper into the warehouse, past rusted machinery and broken crates. Max suddenly stopped, his body rigid. Before Daniel could react, shadows seemed to come alive around them. Dark figures emerged from behind pillars and crates, their faces hidden behind black masks. "Max, defensive!" Daniel shouted, drawing his weapon. But he was a split second too late. The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder. White-hot pain exploded in Daniel's chest, the impact throwing him backward. His gun clattered away as he hit the concrete floor. Through blurring vision, he saw Max launch himself at the nearest attacker, teeth bared in a fierce snarl. "Max, no!" Daniel tried to call out, but his voice came out as a whisper. He could only watch helplessly as his partner fought with savage determination, taking down one attacker after another. The world started to fade around the edges. Max's barks echoed strangely in his ears, growing more distant. The last thing Daniel saw was his faithful partner disappearing into the darkness, pursuing the fleeing attackers. Then everything went black. Sirens pierced through the void. Voices shouted around him, "Officer down! Get the medics in here!" Daniel's eyes fluttered open to find fellow officers kneeling beside him, applying pressure to his wound. The pain in his chest was devastating, but he had only one thought. "Max," he croaked. "Where's Max?" Officer Jenkins, his face tight with concern, shook his head. "No sign of him, Daniel. We're searching the area." He was right here," Daniel managed, trying to sit up despite the stabbing pain. "He went after them." "Stay down," Jenkins ordered. "The medics are almost here. We'll find Max." But as Daniel was loaded into the ambulance, his partner was nowhere to be found. The warehouse and surrounding blocks had been thoroughly searched. There was no trace of Max, no blood, no fur, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only paw prints in the dust that led nowhere. Daniel's eyes flickered open to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. His chest felt like it was on fire, but he was alive. That fact alone confused him. He remembered the shot, remembered feeling his life slipping away on that cold warehouse floor. "Officer Smith? Can you hear me?" A doctor in a white coat leaned over him, checking his vitals. "Max ... Daniel's voice came out as a rasp. "Where's Max?" The doctor exchanged glances with a nurse. "Try not to speak too much right now. You're very lucky to be alive." "The bullet should have killed you," another doctor said, reviewing his charts. "It passed within millimeters of your heart. By all medical understanding, you shouldn't have survived long enough to reach the hospital." Daniel tried to sit up, ignoring the searing pain. "My dog. Where's my partner?" Officer Jenkins stepped forward from the corner of the room. "Daniel, we've been searching nonstop. The security footage from the warehouse shows something unusual." A detective Daniel didn't recognize pulled out a tablet and played a grainy video. In it, Daniel could see himself lying motionless on the ground. Then Max appeared, dragging his body across the concrete floor toward the entrance. The footage showed Max pulling him all the way to where the first responders would find him. But after that, Jenkins hesitated. Max just disappeared. The cameras lost him. No exits were triggered, no alarms set off. He was there 1 second, gone the next. Daniel stared at the footage, playing it over and over. "That's impossible. Dogs don't just vanish. Have you checked every camera? Every alley?" "Multiple times," the detective said. "We've had K9 units searching, not a single trace." The doctors continued explaining his miraculous survival, how the bullet had somehow changed trajectory inside his body, missing every vital organ. But Daniel barely heard them. His mind was stuck on the image of Max dragging him to safety, then vanishing like a ghost. Something happened that night, Daniel insisted, his voice growing stronger. Something that doesn't make sense. Max wouldn't just leave. He wouldn't. The medical staff tried to calm him, telling him he needed rest. But in the following days, Daniel couldn't let it go. He made the nurses wheel his bed to the window, convinced he might spot Max in the hospital parking lot. He demanded to see every piece of security footage again and again. He asked endless questions about the night of the shooting, trying to piece together what happened after he lost consciousness. "You need to focus on recovery," his doctors urged. But Daniel wouldn't let it go. The mystery of Max's disappearance consumed his thoughts. Deep down, he knew something impossible had happened that night, something that defied explanation, and he was determined to find out what it was. Daniel sat in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by stacks of surveillance footage and police reports. His chest still ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness he felt without Max by his side. The house seemed too quiet without the clicking of Max's nails on the hardwood floors. He rewound the warehouse footage for what felt like the 100th time. Something caught his eye, a glitch he hadn't noticed before. At 11:42 p.m., Max appeared in frame A, dragging Daniel's body. But in frame B, taken at the exact same moment from a different angle, the warehouse floor was empty. "That's impossible," Daniel muttered, leaning closer to his laptop screen. He played it again, frame by frame. The inconsistencies were everywhere now that he knew what to look for. In one camera, Max was clearly injured from the fight. In another, taken seconds later, there wasn't a scratch on him. Daniel grabbed his keys, ignoring the doctor's orders to rest. He had to return to the warehouse district. The drive was painful. Every bump in the road sent sharp pains through his chest. But he pressed on. Near the warehouse, he spotted an old man sweeping the sidewalk outside a small convenience store. The store's security cameras would have had a clear view of the street that night. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, showing his badge. "I'm investigating an incident from last week. Did you see anything unusual that night? A German Shepherd police dog?" The old man's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, that beautiful dog. Came running past here around midnight. Healthy as could be, looked like he was on a mission." Daniel's heart skipped. "You're sure? He wasn't injured?" "Clear as day," the man nodded. "Ran right past my store, head held high, like he was following something only he could see. Wasn't hurt at all." Daniel pulled out his phone and showed the man the security footage from inside the warehouse. The clear images of Max fighting the attackers, taking hits, bleeding. "This was just minutes before you say you saw him," Daniel explained. "He was injured. It's not possible he could have been running unharmed." The old man squinted at the footage, then shook his head firmly. "That might be what your camera shows, officer, but I know what I saw. That dog was perfect, like he was glowing almost. Strangest thing I ever saw. Like he wasn't quite real." Daniel's hands trembled as he tucked his phone away. The witness's account made no sense, yet the man seemed absolutely certain. Combined with the glitching footage, Daniel felt like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He thanked the old man and walked slowly back to his car, his mind racing. The security footage showed one reality, but the witness saw another. Both couldn't be true, yet both seemed equally impossible to dismiss. The records department was quiet, except for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights and the clicking of computer keys. Daniel nodded to Sarah, the elderly records keeper who had worked there longer than most officers could remember. She gave him a sympathetic smile. Everyone knew about Max's disappearance. Looking for similar K9 cases, Daniel explained, his voice hoarse. Anything unusual in the last few years? Take your time, dear, Sarah said, buzzing him through to the file room. Daniel's fingers traced along the filing cabinets, stopping at the section marked K9 Unit Incidents. As he pulled out a drawer, his hand brushed against a folder labeled Officer Down, 2021. His heart stopped. That was the year he lost his partner, Mike. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the file. The autopsy report fell out, and his eyes locked onto the medical diagram. The entry wound was marked precisely, just left of the sternum, between the third and fourth ribs. Daniel's hand unconsciously moved to his own chest, touching the bandage beneath his shirt. The exact same spot. That's impossible, he whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. The room seemed to spin as he read further. The bullet trajectory, the damage pattern. It was identical to his own injury. But Mike had died instantly, while Daniel had survived what should have been fatal. He flipped through the pages frantically, looking for anything he might have missed. The words blurred together. Immediate cardiac failure. No chance of survival. Instantaneous death. How? Daniel muttered, running his hands through his hair. How am I alive? The fluorescent light above flickered, making him jump. For a moment, he thought he saw Mac's reflection in the metal filing cabinet, but when he turned, there was nothing there. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him again. Unknown number. Daniel opened the message. If you want to see your dog again, come alone. Daniel's heart raced as another message appeared. Warehouse 17, midnight. Tell no one. He stared at the screen, his cop instinct screaming that this was a trap. But the memory of Mac's loyal eyes, the impossible security footage, the matching wounds, it all had to be connected. Sarah's voice carried from the front desk, asking if he was all right. Daniel quickly gathered the files, shoving them back into the cabinet. He couldn't let anyone know what he'd found, not when he was this close to answers. Fine, he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. Just finishing up. As he walked out, he checked his phone again. The messages had disappeared, leaving no trace they were ever there. Daniel touched his chest wound once more, wondering if he was losing his mind, or if he was finally starting to see the truth. The abandoned veterinary clinic loomed before Daniel, its darkened windows like empty eyes staring into the night. His hand rested on his service weapon as he approached the building, every instinct telling him to call for backup. But Max was in there. He could feel it. The front door creaked open at his touch. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dusty waiting room chairs and faded pet health posters curling off the walls. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else. Something familiar. Max? Daniel called out softly, his voice echoing in the empty space. A low whine answered from deeper inside the clinic. Daniel's heart leaped. He'd know that sound anywhere. Following the noise, he pushed through a set of swinging doors into what must have been the main examination room. There, in the pale moonlight streaming through a high window, sat Max. The German Shepherd looked perfectly healthy, his coat gleaming, showing no signs of the violent fight from that night at the warehouse. Max's tail thumped against the floor, but he didn't move from his spot. Max, come here, boy, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. But Max stayed put, his eyes fixed on something behind Daniel. The hair on the back of Daniel's neck stood up as footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. He won't come to you, said a voice that made Daniel's blood run cold. Not yet. Daniel spun around, his gun raised. The flashlight beam illuminated a face he'd seen countless times in his nightmares. Mike Sullivan, his former partner. The same partner he'd watched die 3 years ago. Mike looked exactly as Daniel remembered him, down to the small scar above his right eyebrow. He wore his old police uniform, pristine and pressed, as if he'd just started his shift. "This isn't real," Daniel breathed, his hand shaking on his weapon. "You're dead. I saw you die." Mike's expression was sad, almost pitying. "You did, just like your fellow officers saw you die last week." He took a step forward, and Daniel stumbled back. "You were never supposed to survive that night. Neither was I." Daniel's back hit the examination table. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The identical gunshot wounds, the missing security footage, Max's impossible behavior. What are you?" Daniel managed to ask. Mike's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Behind Daniel, Max let out another soft whine, but still didn't move from his position. "The better question," Mike said, his voice low and resonant, "is what Max is, and why he chose to save you when I couldn't save myself." Daniel's gun trembled in his hands as he stared at Eric, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The familiar face of his former partner seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the abandoned clinic, both real and impossible at the same time. "How?" Daniel's voice cracked. "We buried you. I was at your funeral." Eric's eyes held a deep sadness as he took a careful step forward. "I know. I watched from behind the trees. Couldn't exactly walk up and tell everyone I was fine, could I?" He gave a hollow laugh. "Not when I didn't understand it myself." Max remained seated between them, his intelligent eyes moving from one man to the other. The German shepherd's unusual calmness made Daniel's skin crawl. This wasn't normal dog behavior. "The night of the ambush," Eric continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I felt the bullets tear through me. I knew I was dying. But then—" He pressed a hand to his chest, right where Daniel remembered the fatal wounds had been. "Something happened. Something I still can't explain." Daniel lowered his gun slowly, his police training warring with the impossible reality before him. "The warehouse. My shooting." He glanced at Max. "Did the same thing happen to me?" Eric nodded grimly. "You're part of it now, Danny. Whatever this is, whatever force keeps stepping in, it's bigger than us. But it always comes with a price." Before Daniel could ask what price Eric meant, the fluorescent lights above them flickered to life, humming with electricity that shouldn't have been running through the abandoned building. The sudden brightness made both men squint, casting harsh shadows across the examination room. Max's ears perked up, his head turning toward the darkened hallway behind Eric. A shadow moved there, too tall to be human, too solid to be a trick of the light. Daniel raised his gun again, but Eric quickly pushed it down. "Don't," Eric warned, his face pale. "They're already here." "They?" Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. "Who are they?" The shadow shifted again, and Max let out a low growl, not aggressive, but acknowledging. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "The ones who decide," Eric said quietly, his eyes fixed on the darkness. "The ones who choose who lives and who dies. The ones who sent the Guardians." Daniel's mouth went dry. "Guardians." Eric's gaze dropped to Max, who sat unflinching as the shadow crept closer. "Why do you think your partner here is so special, Danny? Why do you think he always knows when danger's coming? How do you think he dragged you to safety with injuries that should have killed him?" The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and the shadow in the hallway seemed to grow larger, stretching toward them like a living thing. The two men burst through the clinic's back door, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls of the narrow alley. The night air was thick with fog, and somewhere behind them, whispers floated on the wind, too distant to make out words. but close enough to send chills down Daniel's spine. Max kept pace beside them, his nails clicking against the wet pavement. The dog showed no signs of fear or exhaustion, moving with an almost supernatural grace through the darkness. When they reached the end of the alley, Eric pulled Daniel behind a dumpster, both men breathing hard. The whispers grew fainter, but didn't disappear completely. "Here," Eric said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out what looked like an old leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age and stained with dark brown spots that Daniel recognized immediately as dried blood. This belonged to Officer James Morrison, 1982. He was shot point blank during a drug bust. Daniel took the journal with trembling hands. "Let me guess, he survived?" "Read it," Eric urged, keeping his voice low. "Page 47. Daniel flipped through the brittle pages until he found the entry. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Something saved me today. Not the vest, not luck. My partner, my dog, knew what was coming. He took the bullet meant for my heart. But when I reached him, there was no blood, no wound. He vanished into thin air, leaving only his collar behind. I know now what he truly was, a protector, choosing to sacrifice itself for its chosen one. God help me. I don't understand why I was worthy." Daniel's hands shook as he looked up at Max, who sat watching him with those knowing eyes. Before he could speak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed no number, just blank space. "Hello?" Daniel answered, his throat tight. A mechanical voice crackled through the speaker, each word precisely measured. "Leave the dog. Walk away." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," the voice continued, emotionless. "The Guardian has chosen. Accept it." "No," Daniel growled, anger rising in his chest. "I'm not leaving him. I'm going to find out what's really going on here." "Then you have sealed your fate." The line went dead. Eric grabbed Daniel's arm, his face grave. "Danny, you don't know what you're dealing with. These people, this organization, they've been controlling this for decades. The Guardians, the Chosen Ones, all of it." "I don't care," Daniel said, reaching down to touch Max's head. The German shepherd leaned into his hand, warm and solid and real. "He's my partner, and I'm not letting anyone take him away." The whispers in the alley grew louder, and somewhere in the darkness shadows began to move. Daniel spent the next day following leads, his police badge opening doors that would normally stay shut. Each conversation led him deeper into a maze of impossible coincidences and miraculous survivals. 5 K-9 officers in the past 20 years, all shot in the line of duty, all surviving wounds that should have killed them, and all of them lost their dog shortly after. He found Detective Martin Rhodes in a small house on the outskirts of town. The retired cop was in his 70s now, but his eyes were sharp and alert as he invited Daniel inside. The living room walls were covered with photos, most of them showing Rhodes with his former K-9 partner, a beautiful Belgian Malinois named Scout. "I know why you're here," Rhodes said, settling into a worn armchair. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up an old coffee mug. "You survived something you shouldn't have." Daniel nodded, Max lying quietly at his feet. "How did you know?" "Because I see it in your eyes. The same look I had back in '89 when Scout." Rhodes' voice cracked. He took a shaky breath before continuing. "When Scout saved my life." "What happened?" "Armed robbery. Perp had me dead to rights. Bullet straight through my heart. Or at least that's what should have happened." Rhodes set down his mug and leaned forward. "But Scout, he did something impossible. Next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with barely a scratch. But Scout was gone." Daniel's throat felt dry. Did you ever find him?" Rhodes shook his head, his eyes glistening with tears. 3 days later, they found his collar in the park where we used to train. Nothing else. He looked directly at Max. "It wasn't just luck, son. The dog took your fate. You lived because he was meant to die." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He looked down at Max, who gazed back with those knowing eyes. Everything started making sense. The mysterious survival, the way Max had appeared unharmed at the clinic, the warnings to walk away. "How long?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After my miracle." 3 days. Rhodes reached out and touched Max's head gently. "They're not ordinary dogs, Officer Smith. There's something else, something put here to protect us, even if it means sacrificing themselves." When Daniel left Rhodes's house, his mind was spinning with everything he'd learned. He walked to his car in a daze, Max padding silently beside him. It wasn't until he reached for his door handle that he noticed something was wrong. The car was unlocked. His heart pounding, Daniel opened the driver's door. There, placed carefully on his seat, was a single white note card. In elegant black handwriting, it read, "He only has days left." Daniel's hands shook as he read the words again and again. Beside him, Max sat calmly, as if he had known this was coming all along. Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, racing back to the abandoned veterinary clinic. The note's words echoed in his mind. "He only has days left." Max sat quietly in the back seat, his usual alertness replaced by an unusual stillness that made Daniel's heart ache. When they arrived at the clinic, Max stumbled getting out of the car, something he'd never done before. Daniel's stomach clenched as he watched his partner, usually so strong and graceful, struggle to keep his balance. Inside the dim clinic, Eric was waiting for them. His face fell when he saw Max's condition. "It's starting," he said softly, kneeling beside the German Shepherd. "The transfer is taking effect." "Transfer?" Daniel's voice cracked. "The exchange of fate," Eric explained, running his hand gently over Max's head. "Your death for his life. It's what they do, what they've always done." Max lay down on the cold clinic floor, his breathing labored. When Daniel knelt beside him, Max barely lifted his head to acknowledge him. Those intelligent eyes, always so full of life and understanding, now seemed tired and distant. "There has to be a way," Daniel insisted, pulling out his phone. He started searching through old case files he'd downloaded, his fingers flying across the screen. "I remember something. A case from the 70s. An officer found a way to stop it, to save his dog." Eric's expression darkened. "Daniel." "The file was sealed," Daniel continued, desperately scrolling. "But it exists. Someone figured this out before. We just need to find—" "Daniel," Eric interrupted, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Even if you found it, they wouldn't let you use it. They're watching. Always watching." As if to confirm Eric's words, Daniel's phone suddenly went dead. The clinic's lights flickered ominously. "I don't care," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not letting him die." Later that night, Daniel returned to his apartment, Max cradled in his arms. The moment he opened his door, he knew something was wrong. Papers were strewn everywhere, drawers pulled open, furniture overturned. Someone had torn through every inch of his home. On his kitchen table, untouched amid the chaos, sat another note. "Stop looking!" Daniel set Max down gently on his bed, the only piece of furniture that hadn't been disturbed. His partner curled up weakly, watching him with those knowing eyes. Daniel's throat tightened as he realized Max wasn't surprised by any of this. He'd known all along what his sacrifice would mean. "I'm not giving up," Daniel whispered, sitting beside Max and stroking his fur. "I promise you that." From somewhere in the darkness outside his window, a shadow moved. They were being watched, but Daniel didn't care. He had a lead, that sealed case file. Now he just had to find it before it was too late. The police archives were eerily quiet at 2 a.m. as Daniel crept through the dimly lit rows of filing cabinets. His flashlight beam danced across decades of dusty case files, searching for anything related to John Calloway. His heart pounded so loud he worried someone might hear it. Mac's condition was getting worse by the hour. Daniel couldn't waste any more time. After 30 minutes of searching, he found it, a thin manila folder marked classified in faded red letters. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing yellowed pages from 1978. The report detailed how Officer John Calloway's K-9 partner had saved him from a fatal shooting, just like Max had saved Daniel. But something was different. Unlike the other cases, Calloway's dog hadn't died. Daniel's eyes widened as he read further. The report mentioned Calloway discovering an alternative, but provided no details. Instead, there was only a single address scribbled in the margins, an old lighthouse on the coast, where Calloway was last seen. The rest of the file had been heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out. But that address was enough. It had to be. "Looking for something, Officer Smith?" Daniel spun around. 2 men in dark suits stood at the end of the aisle, their faces expressionless in the dim light. They looked exactly like the kind of people who'd ransack an apartment and leave threatening notes. "You've been quite persistent," the taller one said, taking a step forward. "But this ends now." "You weren't supposed to dig this deep, Officer Smith." The other man's voice was cold. "Put the file down and walk away." Daniel's police training kicked in. He assessed his surroundings. 2 opponents, narrow space, 1 exit behind them. The odds weren't great, but he'd faced worse. "I can't do that," Daniel said firmly, clutching the file. They moved simultaneously. The first man reached for something inside his jacket, but Daniel was faster. He hurled his flashlight at the man's face, causing him to stumble backward. The second man lunged forward, but Daniel ducked and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending them both crashing into a filing cabinet. Metal drawers crashed open, spilling papers everywhere. Daniel scrambled to his feet, shoving past the dazed men. His boots pounded against the floor as he sprinted through the archives, the precious file tucked securely under his arm. Behind him, he heard shouts and footsteps, but he didn't look back. He burst through the emergency exit, setting off alarms, and ran into the parking lot. His car was just ahead. The sound of pursuing footsteps grew fainter as Daniel sped away into the night. His mind fixed on one thing, that lighthouse address. Whatever Calloway had discovered, whatever secret those men were protecting, the answer was waiting there. The old farmhouse loomed before them, a weathered sentinel in the gathering dusk. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled up to the overgrown driveway. Beside him, Eric checked his weapon one last time while Max lay in the back seat. His breathing labored, but his eyes alert and watchful. "You sure about this?" Eric asked, eyeing the dim light filtering through the farmhouse's grimy windows. Daniel nodded. "Max saved my life. I owe him everything." They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Despite his weakened state, Max insisted on following them, staying close to Daniel's leg. The German shepherd's loyalty brought a lump to Daniel's throat. The farmhouse stood 3 stories tall, its white paint peeling and gray with age. Vines crawled up its walls like gnarled fingers, and the wooden steps creaked under their weight as they approached the front porch. Through the windows, they could see the warm glow of what looked like oil lamps. "Someone's definitely home," Eric whispered, drawing his gun. Daniel reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, the door swung open on its own. Warm light spilled out onto the porch, and there, standing in the doorway, was a man who should have been dead for decades. John Calloway looked nothing like his old police photo. His hair had gone completely white, and deep wrinkles lined his face, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, and stood with the straight-back posture of a man who had never quite left his police training behind. "I've been expecting you," Calloway said, his voice surprisingly strong for his age. "Especially you, Officer Smith, and your guardian." His eyes fell on Max with a knowing look. Daniel and Eric exchanged stunned glances. The man before them had disappeared in 1978, over 40 years ago. Yet here he stood, very much alive and seemingly unsurprised by their presence. "That's impossible," Eric breathed. "You should be." "Dead?" Calloway's laugh was warm and genuine. "Many people thought so. Please come inside. Your dog doesn't have much time, and there's much you need to understand." Max walked forward without hesitation, as if he recognized something in Calloway that the humans couldn't see. Daniel followed, his mind reeling. Behind him, Eric kept his hand near his weapon, still not trusting the situation. The interior of the farmhouse was simple, but well kept, lit by several oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Books lined every available surface, their spines bearing titles in languages Daniel didn't recognize. "How are you still alive?" Daniel asked, unable to contain the question any longer. Calloway turned to face them, his expression grave. "The same way you survived that bullet, Officer Smith. The same way your partner survived years ago. We were chosen, and our guardians paid the price." Daniel's eyes swept across the dimly lit room, taking in the countless books and strange artifacts that lined the wooden shelves. But what caught his attention were the photographs, dozens of them, yellowed with age, arranged carefully on one wall. His heart skipped a beat when he spotted one in particular. "That's impossible," he whispered, stepping closer to the black and white photograph. It showed a younger Calloway, dressed in a police uniform from the 1970s, standing proudly next to a German Shepherd that could have been Mac's twin. The resemblance was uncanny. The same intelligent eyes, the same protective stance. Eric moved to stand beside him, his face pale. "The markings. They're identical." "You're not ready for the truth," Calloway said softly, watching them from his position near an old leather armchair. His face held a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "Not yet." "We don't have time for riddles," Daniel snapped, frustration building in his chest. "Max is dying. I need answers." As if on cue, a heavy thud echoed through the room. Daniel spun around to see Max collapsed on the wooden floor, his sides heaving with labored breaths. The German Shepherd's eyes, usually so bright and alert, were growing dim. "Max!" Daniel dropped to his knees beside his partner, hands trembling as they ran through Mac's fur. The dog's skin felt cold despite the warm evening air. Calloway didn't seem surprised by Mac's collapse. He moved with deliberate slowness to a cabinet in the corner, his movements precise and measured. "He doesn't have much time," he said, his voice carrying a weight of knowledge that made Daniel's spine tingle. "But there is a way to stop it." "Then tell us." Daniel's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, he saved my life." "That's exactly why this is happening," Calloway replied, turning to face them. In his hands, he held what looked like an ancient leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. "Your survival came at a cost that Max willingly chose to pay." Eric stepped forward, his police training evident in his cautious stance. "What do you mean, chose?" "Look at that photograph again," Calloway said, nodding toward the wall. "That dog, my partner Rex, made the same choice, just like every guardian, before and since." Daniel looked down at Max, who, despite his weakness, managed to lift his head and meet his gaze with those knowing eyes. For the first time, Daniel saw something there that he'd always missed, an intelligence that went far beyond normal canine awareness. "I know why you're here," Calloway continued, placing the old book on a nearby table. "But understanding what Max truly is, what all guardians are, that's a truth that will change everything you think you know about the world." As night fell, John led them to a small clearing behind the farmhouse. A crackling fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, while Max rested his head on Daniel's lap, each breath becoming more labored. John settled into an old wooden chair, his ageless face illuminated by the flames. "What I'm about to tell you, it's been kept secret for generations." He paused, his eyes distant. "These dogs, Max, Rex, all of them, they're not just animals. They're guardians." Daniel's hand instinctively tightened in Max's fur. The German shepherd's eyes reflected the firelight with an almost supernatural glow. "Guardians?" Eric leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ancient beings who choose to take the form of dogs," John explained, his words measured and careful. "They bond with officers who have a pure heart, those who truly serve and protect. The connection goes deeper than anything you can imagine." Daniel remembered all the times Max had seemed to know exactly what he was thinking, how the dog had always been there in his darkest moments. It all made sense now. "But every time they save us," John continued, his voice heavy with emotion, "they sacrifice a piece of their own existence. It's a choice they make willingly, out of love and duty." Eric's face showed recognition, remembering his own miraculous survival. "That's why they disappear afterward." "They fade away," John nodded, pain evident in his expression. "Their energy, their very essence, transfers to us in that moment between life and death. They trade their life force for ours." Daniel looked down at Max, understanding finally dawning. The dog, no, the guardian, had given up part of himself to save Daniel that night at the warehouse. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized the true depth of Max's sacrifice. "But you," Eric's voice cracked. "You broke the cycle? How did you do it?" John fell silent, staring into the flames. The crackling of the fire filled the heavy pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I chose to let go." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, desperate for answers that might save Max. "Rex saved me 3 times, John explained, running his fingers over an old scar on his arm. "Each time I felt our bond grow stronger, but I could see him fading. After the 3rd time, I knew one more would take him forever." He looked up at them, his eyes reflecting decades of pain and wisdom. "So I made the hardest choice of my life. I walked away from the Force, from everything I knew. I chose to preserve what remained of his life instead of risking mine." Max whimpered softly, and Daniel felt his heart breaking. The choice John was describing seemed impossible. How could anyone choose between their duty and their partner's life? The fire crackled softly as John leaned forward, his face grave. "There's something else you need to know about guardians," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Each one has a final command, a last wish they give to their human partner before they fade away." Daniel felt Max shift against his leg, the dog's breathing becoming more shallow. "What kind of command?" "It's different for each guardian," John explained, reaching into his jacket to pull out a worn leather notebook. "But it's always something that will help their human move forward, to keep living even after they're gone." He opened the notebook, revealing pages of handwritten notes. "Rex's final command to me was remember. He wanted me to keep his memory alive, to never forget what we shared." Eric moved closer to the fire, his face troubled. "Is there any way to stop it? To reverse what's happening?" John's expression darkened. "There is, but the price is steep." He looked directly at Daniel, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Breaking the bond between guardian and human isn't natural. It goes against everything they stand for. To do it, you must make an impossible choice: your life or his. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? The energy transfer can be reversed, John said slowly. But it means giving back everything Max sacrificed to save you. You would die, and he would live. Max lifted his head weakly, looking at Daniel with those knowing eyes. The German shepherd's once bright gaze was now clouded with exhaustion. There has to be another way, Daniel insisted, his voice cracking. I can't just let him die, but I can't. He couldn't finish the sentence. That's exactly what makes you worthy of a guardian, John said softly. Your willingness to sacrifice everything for each other. But sometimes the greatest love means accepting what cannot be changed. Max suddenly let out a pained whimper, his body trembling. Daniel quickly knelt beside him, cradling the dog's head in his hands. For the first time since this began, real fear gripped his heart. Max's condition was deteriorating faster than he'd realized. How long? Daniel asked, not taking his eyes off his partner. Days, maybe hours, John replied gently. Each guardian is different, but once the process begins, it can't be slowed. Daniel's mind raced, searching desperately for alternatives, for any solution that would save them both. But as he looked into Max's trusting eyes, he saw something there he'd never noticed before: acceptance. The guardian had known all along what his choice would mean, and he'd made it willingly. I can't lose him, Daniel whispered, more to himself than the others. But even as he said the words, he could feel Max's strength fading beneath his hands. The peaceful moment shattered as gunfire erupted outside the farmhouse. Glass windows exploded inward, sending shards flying across the room. Daniel instinctively dove for cover behind an old couch, pulling Max with him. Come out, Calloway, a harsh voice commanded from outside. We've been hunting you for 40 years. It ends tonight. John remained eerily calm, moving to peek through a broken window. The preservers, he muttered. They think they're protecting the natural order by keeping the guardians secret. More bullets tore through the walls. Eric crouched near the kitchen doorway, his service weapon drawn. How many? At least 12, John answered, his voice steady. They've surrounded the house. Suddenly, Max's head snapped up. Despite his weakened state, the German shepherd struggled to his feet, his muscles trembling with effort. Daniel tried to hold him back, but Max's eyes were alert and focused, scanning the room with renewed purpose. Stay down, boy, Daniel pleaded. You're too weak. The front door burst open with a thunderous crash. 2 men in tactical gear stormed in, weapons raised. Before anyone could react, Max launched himself forward with impossible speed. His powerful jaws clamped down on the first attacker's arm, sending the man's weapon clattering to the floor. The second intruder took aim, but Max was already moving, knocking him off balance with a powerful shoulder charge. Max, no! Daniel shouted, watching in horror as his partner fought with desperate strength. This is your moment, Daniel. He's choosing for you. John's voice cut through the chaos. The Guardian always chooses. More attackers poured in through windows and doors. Eric provided covering fire, forcing them back momentarily. We need to move now. Daniel watched in awe as Max continued to fight, his movements precise despite his failing strength. The dog was creating a path toward the back door, deliberately clearing their escape route. Go, John ordered, picking up one of the fallen attacker's weapons. I'll hold them here. This was always meant to be my last stand. John, come with us, Eric called out. No, John smiled sadly. I've run long enough. Maybe it's time the world learned the truth about the Guardians. Max barked sharply, urgently calling Daniel toward the back exit. Eric was already moving that way, picking off any attackers who tried to circle around. Daniel hesitated for a split second, looking back at John. The old officer stood tall in the middle of his farmhouse, facing the front door with quiet determination. Their eyes met one final time, and John gave him a slight nod. "Thank you," Daniel managed to say before Mac's insistent nudging pushed him toward safety. Together, Daniel, Eric, and Max burst through the back door into the darkness of the woods. Behind them, gunfire and shouts echoed from the farmhouse as John Calloway made his final stand. The old barn creaked in the night wind as Daniel, Eric, and Max huddled in its musty darkness. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Max lay on his side, his breathing shallow and labored, each breath a visible struggle. Daniel knelt beside his partner, tears streaming down his face for the first time in years. His hands trembled as they stroked Mac's fur, feeling the weak rise and fall of his chest. "Please, boy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "Just hold on. We'll figure this out. I'll find a way to fix this." His fingers curled into Mac's fur, holding on as if he could physically keep his partner from slipping away. "I can't lose you too. I can't." Eric watched from a few feet away, his expression pained as he witnessed his friend's anguish. The sight of Daniel, the toughest cop he knew, breaking down stirred something in him. "Daniel," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" Daniel didn't look up, his attention fixed on Mac's struggling form. "Is this really about saving Max?" Eric paused, choosing his words carefully. "Or about fixing yourself?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He froze, his hands still buried in Mac's fur.
"What are you talking about?" Daniel's voice was defensive, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed his uncertainty.
"Look at yourself, partner," Eric said gently. "Ever since I died, you've built walls around yourself. You wouldn't let anyone close, except Max. And now that you might lose him..." Eric's voice softened. "You're not just fighting for his life. You're fighting against the very idea of loss itself." Daniel's shoulders slumped as the truth of Eric's words sank in. Images flashed through his mind. His partner's supposed death, the years of isolation that followed, the way he'd pushed away every attempt at friendship or connection. Even his fellow officers had learned to keep their distance from the cop who refused to let anyone in. "I Dot." Daniel's voice broke. "I don't know how to let go." Max stirred at the sound of Daniel's pain. Despite his weakness, the German Shepherd lifted his head, his intelligent eyes fixed on his partner's face. With what seemed like enormous effort, Max raised his paw and placed it on Daniel's hand. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. Daniel felt it in his soul. Max's final command, as clear as if it had been spoken aloud: "Live." The simplicity of it brought fresh tears to Daniel's eyes. Not just survive, not just exist, but truly live. Accept loss, embrace connection, feel everything, even the pain. It was Max's final gift to him, the most important lesson a guardian could teach. "Oh, Max," Daniel whispered, understanding at last what his partner had been trying to show him all along. The first light of dawn crept through the barn's weathered walls, painting everything in soft golden hues. Daniel sat with Max's head cradled in his lap, his partner's breathing growing fainter with each passing moment. Eric stood quietly nearby, a respectful witness to this sacred goodbye. Daniel's tears had dried, replaced by a deep, calm understanding. He gazed down at Mac's tired eyes, seeing in them all the love and wisdom that had guided him through his darkest days. "I understand now, boy," Daniel whispered, his voice steady despite the ache in his heart. "You've been teaching me all along, haven't you? about living, about loving. His fingers gently scratched behind Mac's ears, just the way his partner had always loved. About letting go. Mac's tail thumped weakly against the hay-strewn floor, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "Thank you," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being my guardian, my partner, my best friend." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Mac's. "I promise I'll live, Max. Really live. For both of us." As the sun rose higher, something extraordinary began to happen. A soft golden light seemed to emanate from within Max's body. It started as a gentle glow, like sunlight through autumn leaves growing steadily brighter. Daniel didn't pull away. He held Max close, feeling his partner's physical form becoming lighter, more ethereal. The German shepherd's eyes, still fixed on Daniel's face, were filled with peace and pride. "Goodbye, boy," Daniel whispered, and finally, fully let go. Max's body dissolved into pure light, sparkling motes that drifted upward like golden snow before fading into the morning air. Daniel fell to his knees in the empty space where his partner had been, but the crushing weight of grief he'd expected didn't come. Instead, he felt an inexplicable sense of peace, of completion. He had learned Mac's final lesson. Several days later, Daniel and Eric drove back to John Calloway's farmhouse. The morning was crisp and clear, the countryside peaceful. As they pulled up to the old building, it was clear John was gone. The house stood silent and empty. But there, sitting patiently on the worn wooden doorstep, was a tiny German shepherd puppy. It looked up at them as they approached, and Daniel stopped in his tracks. Those eyes, warm, intelligent, and somehow ancient, were hauntingly familiar. The puppy stood up, its tail wagging, and took a few steps toward Daniel. Eric let out a soft gasp beside him. "Daniel," he whispered, "look at its eyes." The puppy sat down at Daniel's feet, looking up at him with Mac's eyes, waiting to begin a new chapter. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning activity, but to Daniel, everything felt muted and distant. His footsteps echoed heavily as he walked past Mac's empty kennel, the metal gate standing open like a silent reminder of what he'd lost. The familiar scent of coffee and paper files couldn't mask the absence of Mac's comforting presence. At his desk, Daniel's eyes kept drifting to the bottom drawer where he'd stored Mac's leash. He couldn't bring himself to take it home, but he couldn't throw it away either. The worn leather held too many memories: early morning training sessions, late-night patrols, quiet moments when it was just the two of them against the world. "Smith?" A gentle voice broke through his thoughts. Officer Kelly Monroe stood beside his desk, concern etched across her face. She was one of the few officers who didn't tiptoe around him like he might break. "You've been staring at that report for 20 minutes. Daniel straightened in his chair, trying to focus on the paperwork in front of him. "I'm fine, Kelly, just tired." "We all miss him," she said softly, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "Max was special to everyone here." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The emptiness felt physical, like a weight pressing against his chest. Every corner of the precinct held echoes of Max, the water bowl by the break room that no one had the heart to move, the scratches on his desk where Max would rest his head, the tennis ball still wedged under the filing cabinet. That evening, Daniel's apartment felt especially hollow. He'd gotten used to the silence, but it still hurt. No clicking of nails on hardwood, no gentle breathing from Mac's bed in the corner, no warm body leaning against his leg while he watched TV. As he collected his mail, a plain white envelope caught his attention. No return address, just his name written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, the message brief but clear. Some bonds never break. When the time comes, you'll know. Daniel read the words several times, his hands trembling slightly. He thought of the puppy at the farmhouse, those familiar eyes that seemed to look straight into his soul. The letter felt like both a promise and a warning, though of what, he wasn't sure. He placed the letter on his coffee table and sank into his couch, exhaustion washing over him. The apartment walls seemed to close in, every empty space a reminder of what he'd lost. But something about Calloway's words stirred something inside him. Not hope exactly, but possibility. For now, though, the absence remained, raw and real. Daniel closed his eyes, remembering Mac's final moments, the warmth of that golden light and the peace in those loyal eyes. The letter's words echoed in his mind. Some bonds never break. Daniel stood at the entrance of the Riverside K-9 Training Academy, his resignation letter heavy in his jacket pocket. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds, where young dogs bounded through obstacle courses with their handlers. His chest tightened at the familiar sight. He'd driven here planning to drop off his letter and walk away from everything, the force, the memories, all of it. But something made him pause, his hand frozen on the door handle. Through the chain-link fence, he watched the training sessions, remembering countless mornings spent here with Max. "Can I help you, Officer Smith?" A woman in her 50s approached, her academy director badge catching the sunlight. "I'm Sarah Martinez. We've heard so much about you and Max." Before Daniel could respond, excited barking cut through the air. A small German Shepherd puppy burst from between two handlers, racing straight toward him. Daniel's heart stopped. It was the same puppy from the farmhouse, those hauntingly familiar eyes fixed on him. The puppy skidded to a halt at Daniel's feet, sitting perfectly at attention, exactly as Max used to do. Not the clumsy positioning of an untrained pup, but the precise practiced stance of a seasoned K-9 officer. "That's unusual," Director Martinez said, watching the puppy with curiosity. "This little one showed up 3 days ago, just sitting outside our gates at dawn. No chip, no collar, nothing. We've been calling him Scout." Daniel knelt slowly, his hands trembling as the puppy pressed its head against his palm. Another of Mac's signature moves. 3 days ago, he whispered. The same day Max had. "He wouldn't let anyone near him at first," Martinez continued. "Just sat there, watching, waiting, like he knew exactly where he needed to be." She paused, studying Daniel's face, almost like he was waiting for someone specific. The puppy's tail wagged gently, its eyes never leaving Daniel's face. There was something in those eyes, wisdom, understanding, impossible knowledge. Daniel felt the resignation letter crumple in his pocket as he scratched behind the puppy's ears. "Has he responded to any of the trainers?" Daniel asked, his voice rough with emotion. Martinez shook her head. "That's a strange thing. He's ignored every handler we've introduced him to. But look at him now. He acts like he's known you his whole life." The puppy pressed closer, and Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. The emptiness that had haunted him since losing Max didn't exactly disappear, but it changed, transformed into something different, something like hope. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Martinez asked softly, watching their interaction with wonder. "I've never seen anything quite like this in all my years here." Daniel spent the next few days visiting the academy, watching the puppy from a distance. Each time, Scout would immediately spot him and bound over, showing the same eager devotion Max had always displayed. But something held Daniel back from making it official. "You're brooding again," Officer Kelly Monroe said, joining him at his desk one morning. She placed a coffee in front of him, black, no sugar, just like he always took it. Kelly had been his friend for years, one of the few people who understood his connection with Max. "I'm not brooding," Daniel muttered, but his eyes drifted to Mac's old leash, still hanging on its hook. Kelly pulled up a chair, her kind face serious. "You know, I've watched you these past few weeks. You're different since—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Since Max. Not just sad. You're lighter somehow. Like you finally let go of something heavy you'd been carrying." Daniel turned to look at her, surprised by her insight. Kelly had always been observant. It made her an excellent officer. But she rarely spoke about personal matters. "That puppy at the academy," she continued. "He needs someone. And maybe you need him too." She smiled softly. "You didn't save Max, Daniel. Max saved you. Maybe it's time to do the same for this little guy." Her words hit him hard. Daniel remembered Max's final command. Live. Was this what Max had meant? That afternoon, Daniel returned to the academy. Scout was already waiting by the fence, tail wagging hopefully. Director Martinez let them use the private training area, where Daniel sat cross-legged on the ground, letting the puppy approach on his own terms. Scout moved with the same careful precision Max had shown, circling Daniel once before sitting directly in front of him. Those eyes, so wise, so knowing, studied Daniel's face. "I'm not trying to replace him," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than the puppy. "I could never replace Max." Scout tilted his head, considering Daniel's words. Then, slowly and deliberately, the puppy lifted his right paw and placed it on Daniel's hand, exactly as Max had done countless times before. It was their signal, their private gesture that meant, "I'm here. I understand." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had never mentioned this detail to anyone, not even Kelly. It was something only he and Max had shared. The puppy waited patiently, paw still resting on Daniel's hand, asking for nothing but silently offering everything. In that moment, Daniel understood. This wasn't about replacing Max. This was about honoring him by giving another chance at the same profound connection that had saved his life. That evening, Daniel brought Echo home, carrying the squirming puppy in his arms. The small German shepherd explored the apartment with boundless curiosity, sniffing every corner and investigating each new discovery with excited little yips. Daniel watched him, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Echo's presence filled the crushing silence that had haunted the apartment since Max's departure. Though the puppy was nothing like Max in personality, where Max had been stoic and reserved, Echo was all enthusiasm and energy. There was something familiar in the way he moved, in how he studied everything with those intelligent eyes. "Guess we should get you settled in," Daniel said softly, moving to the closet where he'd stored Max's things. He hadn't been able to bring himself to look through them since that day, but now it felt right. He pulled out the box, setting it on the living room floor. Echo immediately trotted over, nose twitching with interest. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he lifted out Max's old bed, still carrying his scent. Next came the toys, the extra leash, and finally, the collar. Daniel ran his fingers over the worn leather, remembering how proud Max had looked the day he'd first put it on him. Echo sat quietly beside him, as if sensing the importance of the moment. As Daniel turned the collar over in his hands, something caught his eye, a slight bulge in the leather he'd never noticed before. Frowning, he examined it more closely. There, hidden in the collar's lining, was a small seam that didn't match the rest of the stitching. With careful fingers, Daniel worked at the hidden compartment until it gave way. Inside, nestled in the leather, was a small metallic disc no bigger than a quarter. The surface was scratched and tarnished, but the engraving was clear. J.C. "John Calloway," Daniel whispered, his heart racing. Echo's ears perked up at the name. Daniel turned the disc over and over in his hands, mind whirling. John had known, somehow, he'd known exactly what would happen with Max. He'd planted this disc long before Daniel had ever met him, waiting for this exact moment. Echo pressed against Daniel's leg, letting out a small whine. When Daniel looked down, the puppy was staring at the disc with an intensity that seemed beyond his young age. Once again, Daniel was struck by the feeling that there was more to this puppy than met the eye. "What else did you know, John?" Daniel murmured, holding the disc up to the light. "What else were you trying to tell us?" The next morning, Daniel drove to Calloway's farmhouse with Echo curled up in the passenger seat. The metallic disc sat heavy in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the mystery still unsolved. The autumn wind rustled through dying leaves as they pulled up to the weathered building, now looking more abandoned than ever. "Stay close," Daniel told Echo, who padded faithfully by his side as they approached the house. Inside, dust covered everything. Furniture had been moved, drawers left open, clear signs of a hasty departure. But something caught Daniel's trained eye. Tiny marks scratched into the wooden door frames, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. Arrow symbols, numbers. They formed a pattern leading deeper into the house. Daniel followed them, Echo trotting beside him until they reached the kitchen. There, beneath a worn rug, he found a trap door. "John, you clever bastard," Daniel muttered, pulling it open. Metal stairs descended into darkness. Using his flashlight, Daniel made his way down, Echo following without hesitation. The bunker was surprisingly large, its walls lined with filing cabinets and old computers. But it was the center table that drew Daniel's attention, covered in papers, photographs, and leather-bound journals. Decades of research lay before him. Pictures of German shepherds throughout history, all bearing that same intelligent look he'd seen in Mac's eyes. Military reports dating back to World War I, describing dogs performing impossible feats to save their handlers. News clippings about miraculous survivals, each featuring a K-9 officer who disappeared shortly after. Daniel's hands shook as he opened one of the journals. John's neat handwriting filled every page, documenting the pattern he'd discovered. The Guardians weren't just special dogs. They were something ancient, something that had been protecting humanity for centuries. In the final journal, dated just weeks ago, Daniel found a note addressed to him. "Officer Smith, you were never meant to find me, but you were meant to continue the legacy. The truth about the Guardians must be preserved, but also protected. There are those who would use this knowledge for their own gain, who would try to control what cannot be controlled. I trust you understand now why Max had to leave, why they all must leave, eventually. But remember this truth, written in the first records I ever found. The Guardians never die. They only return when they are needed. Take care of Echo. He has chosen you just as Max did, just as they all do." Echo whined softly, pressing against Daniel's leg. When Daniel looked down, he saw that same ancient wisdom in the puppy's eyes, the same look Max had given him on that final morning. The drive home felt different this time. Daniel watched Echo dozing in the passenger seat, John's journals safely tucked in a box behind them. Street lights flickered past as evening settled over the city, casting long shadows across the dashboard. When they arrived home, Daniel carried the box of journals inside while Echo trotted ahead, already familiar with their routine after just a few days together. The apartment felt warmer somehow, less empty than it had since Mac's departure. Daniel set the box down on his kitchen table and sank into his favorite armchair, emotionally drained, but oddly at peace. The weight that had been crushing his chest since Mac's disappearance felt lighter now. Understanding had replaced grief, acceptance had overcome loss. Echo padded over, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The puppy rested his head on Daniel's knee. looking up with those knowing eyes. Daniel scratched behind his ears, just like he used to do with Max. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Daniel murmured, smiling, as Echo leaned into his touch. "Both of you did." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt himself truly smile. Not the forced expression he'd worn at work, but a genuine smile that reached his eyes. The kind of smile that came with understanding, with acceptance, with hope. He glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. Time for bed. Daniel stood up, stretching his tired muscles. Echo followed him through the apartment as he went through his nightly routine, checking the locks, drawing the blinds. In the bedroom, Echo circled 3 times before settling into his new bed, the same spot where Max used to sleep. Daniel reached for the light switch, his hand pausing as memories of countless nights with Max flooded back. But this time, the memories didn't hurt. They felt like old friends, welcome and warm. Just as his fingers touched the switch, a sound broke the silence. A low, familiar growl. Daniel's heart stopped. He knew that sound. It was the same warning growl Max would make before every mission, alerting Daniel to potential danger. Echo sat alert in his bed, but he wasn't the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, exactly like Max. Daniel didn't feel afraid. Instead, a warm certainty filled his chest as he smiled into the darkness. "Welcome home, buddy," he whispered softly. Autumn had settled over the city, painting the streets in shades of gold and amber. Officer Daniel Smith sat in his patrol car, watching Echo fidget in the passenger seat. The young German shepherd couldn't seem to stay still, constantly shifting and whining softly, so different from Max's stoic presence. "Easy there, buddy," Daniel said, reaching over to scratch behind Echo's ears. The puppy was only 4 months into his training, but Chief Harrison had fast-tracked their partnership, impressed by Echo's natural abilities. They cruised down Morrison Street, a route Daniel had patrolled hundreds of times before. Echo's ears suddenly perked up, his body tensing. Before Daniel could react, the dog let out a series of sharp, aggressive barks, something he'd never done before. Daniel followed Echo's gaze to a man in a worn leather jacket walking quickly toward an old warehouse. Nothing seemed obviously suspicious about him, but Echo's barking grew more insistent. Okay, I hear you," Daniel muttered, pulling the car over. The similarity struck him like a physical blow. 12 years ago, Max had reacted the same way to a seemingly innocent situation. That day had led them to one of their biggest weapons busts. Echo practically dragged Daniel toward the warehouse, straining against his leash. Another stark contrast to Max's disciplined heel. The man spotted them and broke into a run. "Police! Stop right there!" Daniel shouted, but the suspect disappeared inside the building. Echo pulled harder, leading Daniel through the maze of abandoned machinery. The warehouse was dimly lit, dust motes dancing in the few rays of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. Echo moved with surprising purpose, ignoring several possible hiding spots that Daniel would have checked. Instead, the young dog made straight for a stack of old crates in the far corner. The suspect emerged from behind them, wielding a crowbar. But before he could swing, Echo launched himself forward with a fierce growl, knocking the man off balance. Daniel moved in quickly, securing the suspect while Echo stood guard, his posture eerily reminiscent of Max's. A search of the crates revealed exactly what Echo had somehow known they'd find. Dozens of illegal firearms, still in their original packaging, just like that case with Max, all those years ago. "How did you know?" Daniel whispered to Echo as backup arrived. The young dog just wagged his tail, looking up at Daniel with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond explanation. Officer Kelly Monroe approached, whistling at the weapons cache. "Pretty impressive for a rookie dog," she said, patting Echo's head. "Almost like he's done this before." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he watched Echo inspect the scene, moving with a confidence that seemed impossible for his age and experience level. The dog paused, placing his paw on a specific crate, exactly where Max had found the dealer's ledger 12 years ago. The morning sun filtered through Daniel's kitchen window as he stared at the plain brown package on his counter. No return address, just his name written in careful block letters. Echo sat beside him, head tilted curiously as Daniel carefully opened it. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, lay a tarnished police badge. Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted it, recognizing the old-style shield and the number etched on its surface. 2747, John Calloway's badge number. It looked exactly like the ones in the old photographs he'd seen at the farmhouse. A folded note fluttered to the floor. Echo picked it up gently in his mouth, placing it in Daniel's outstretched hand. The message was brief, written in the same careful handwriting as the address. You passed the test. The last secret is where it all began. Daniel's heart raced. There was only one place that could mean. The warehouse where he'd almost died, where Max had saved him, where everything had changed. The drive there felt longer than usual. Echo sat quietly in the passenger seat, unusually still, as if he sensed the importance of their destination. The warehouse looked different in daylight, less threatening, but somehow more haunting. Yellow police tape still fluttered from a broken window, marking where the shooting had occurred. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak sunlight. Daniel's footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as he walked to the exact spot where he'd fallen. Echo whined softly, pawing at the ground near a pile of debris. What is it, boy? Daniel knelt beside his dog, pushing aside broken pieces of wood and concrete. His hand struck something solid, a metal edge buried beneath the rubble. With Echo's help, he cleared away more debris, revealing a heavy-duty lockbox, its surface covered in decades of dust. The lock was old, but sturdy. Daniel was about to call for tools when Echo nudged his hand toward the badge still in his pocket. Looking closer at the badge's surface, Daniel noticed unusual wear marks around its edges. On a hunch, he pressed it against the lock. It fit perfectly. Inside the box lay a stack of yellowed files, their edges brittle with age. The top folder bore a familiar symbol, the same one he'd seen on the suits of the men who tried to stop his investigation. But these weren't just case files. They were evidence. Photographs, reports, and documents detailed decades of cover-ups involving K-9 officers and their mysteriously vanishing partners. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted a photograph from the 1950s. It showed a German Shepherd that could have been Max's twin, standing beside a young officer. Written on the back, First Guardian identified, Subject 0. Echo pressed against his leg, offering silent support as Daniel sifted through the revelations before him. But one question kept nagging at his mind. Who had sent him Calloway's badge? And why now? Daniel's fingers trembled as he spread the files across the dusty warehouse floor. Each manila folder told a similar story. Brave officers, loyal dogs, miraculous survivals, and mysterious disappearances. The dates stretched back to 1927. Each case meticulously documented with photographs, medical records, and personal accounts. Echo lay beside him, his warm presence grounding Daniel as he absorbed the weight of what he was reading. These weren't just random incidents. They were a legacy, a sacred trust passed down through generations of officers and their guardian companions. One report caught his eye. Officer Sarah Martinez, 1965. She'd survived a warehouse fire that should have killed her, only to lose her German Shepherd partner a week later. The following pages detailed how she went on to establish one of the country's first specialized K-9 training facilities. Another file showed Detective James Cooper, 1982, who lived through a shootout that left him with supposedly fatal wounds. His dog vanished the next day. Cooper later became instrumental in developing advanced K9 handling protocols still used today. Pattern after pattern emerged from the yellowed pages. Every single officer who accepted their guardian's sacrifice had gone on to protect and guide future K9 units. They hadn't just returned to regular duty. They dedicated their lives to ensuring the Guardian legacy continued. Daniel sat back, overwhelmed by the responsibility these documents represented. He'd always thought of police work as his calling, but now a deeper purpose beckoned. These files weren't just history. They were a roadmap, showing him two distinct paths forward. He could return to his regular duties, pretend none of this had happened, or he could step into something bigger, something that honored Mac's sacrifice and protected future Guardians and their partners. Echo's nose suddenly nudged Daniel's hand, pushing a single sheet of paper toward him. Unlike the other aged documents, this one was crisp and white. Daniel picked it up, his heart skipping a beat as he read the header. K9 Academy Program, Director Application Form. His eyes fell to the date field and he nearly dropped the paper. It was dated 6 months in the future. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting as the note that had come with Calloway's badge, was his name. Daniel Smith, Guardian Program Director. Echo sat up straight, his eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that reminded him so much of Mac's. The choice lay before him now: continue as he was, or embrace a destiny that seemed to have been waiting for him all along. The weight of the decision pressed down on him as he held the application form, feeling as though every guardian and officer from those files was watching, waiting to see what he would choose. The autumn breeze rustled through the newly hung sign. Max and Echo K9 Training Academy. Daniel stood in the courtyard, watching as Echo demonstrated proper tracking techniques to a small group of officers. The German Shepherd moved with precise grace, every motion a perfect blend of instinct and training. 6 months had passed since Daniel made his decision. Retiring from active duty hadn't been easy, but establishing the academy gave him a sense of purpose he'd never known before. The facility, once an abandoned police training center, now hummed with new life and energy. His first class of recruits was special, each officer carrying their own burden of loss. There was Sarah Chen, who'd lost her partner in a drug bust gone wrong. Mike Rodriguez, whose K9 partner died saving a child from a burning building. And James Turner, who still blamed himself for his partner's death during a high-speed chase. Daniel saw himself in each of them, the guilt, the pain, the inability to move forward. But he also saw something else, the potential for healing and growth. Echo seemed to sense it too, paying special attention to those who needed it most. Remember, Daniel addressed the group, his voice carrying across the training yard, your connection with these dogs goes beyond commands and protocols. It's about trust, understanding, and sometimes... He paused, thinking of Max. It's about learning to let go. Later that evening, Daniel sat in his office, sorting through new applications. The stack seemed endless. Word had spread quickly about the Academy's unique approach to K9 training. As he reached for another folder, a name caught his eye, making his heart skip a beat. Catherine Calloway, he read aloud, his fingers tracing the familiar surname. The application included a letter that made his hands shake slightly as he unfolded it. Dear Officer Smith, my grandfather, John Calloway, left me a letter to be opened on my 25th birthday. In it, he told me about the Guardians, about Max, and about you. He said, when the time was right, I would find my way to your academy. I'm ready to continue what he started. Daniel leaned back in his chair, Echo's head resting on his knee. The pieces were falling into place, not as an end, but as a continuation. John had known all along that the legacy of the Guardians needed to be preserved, protected, and passed on with care and understanding. Through the window, Daniel watched his students working with their dogs in the fading light. Each pair moved together, learning to trust, to protect, to understand. The pain that had brought them here was slowly transforming into something stronger: purpose. Echo nudged his hand gently, reminding Daniel of the stack of applications still waiting. Catherine Calloway's folder sat open on his desk, a bridge between past and future, between loss and renewal. The setting sun painted the training grounds in shades of amber and gold. Most of the recruits had gone home for the day, leaving Daniel alone with Echo in the quiet courtyard. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, rustling through fallen leaves that scattered across the ground. Echo, who had been practicing advanced tracking maneuvers moments before, suddenly stopped. His ears perked forward, and his body became absolutely still. Daniel had seen this pose before. It was the same way Max used to stand when sensing something beyond normal perception. The German shepherd's eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun melted into a symphony of purple and orange. There was something almost supernatural about his stillness, as if he was listening to voices only he could hear. Daniel walked over slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He knelt beside Echo, placing a gentle hand on the dog's shoulder. The fur felt warm beneath his palm, and for a moment he could have sworn he felt the same electricity he used to feel with Max. "You feel it too, don't you?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Echo didn't move, didn't even twitch an ear in response. He remained focused on something invisible in the distance, standing like a silent guardian at his post. In that moment, everything clicked into place for Daniel. The realization washed over him like a warm wave. Max had never truly left. Neither had Calloway's guardian or any of the others who had come before. They were all part of something larger, something eternal that flowed through time, like an endless river. He thought about Catherine Calloway's application on his desk, about the gleam in Echo's eyes when he first met him, about all the impossible coincidences that had led him here. It wasn't coincidence at all. It was purpose, destiny, something bigger than fate itself. Echo finally turned to look at Daniel, and in the fading light, his eyes caught the last rays of the setting sun. They glowed with an uncanny, familiar gleam, the same knowing look he'd seen in Max's eyes countless times before. It wasn't just Echo looking back at him. It was every guardian who had ever protected, ever sacrificed, ever loved. The dog's eyes held that otherworldly gleam, reflecting something ancient and wise, something that transcended the physical bounds of life and death. In that gaze, Daniel saw the truth he'd been searching for since losing Max. The Guardians were never truly gone. They lived on, passing their legacy through time, choosing their partners, continuing their sacred duty. The evening shadows stretched across Daniel's living room, so different from the lonely darkness that had once filled his home. The soft glow of a table lamp cast warm light across photographs and memories that now decorated his walls. Snapshots of successful K-9 graduates, letters of gratitude, and moments captured with both Max and Echo. Echo lay contentedly at Daniel's feet, his steady breathing a constant reminder that Daniel was no longer alone. The young German shepherd's eyes followed his every move as Daniel stood before the old wooden shelf, Max's worn leather collar held carefully in his hands. He ran his thumb over the scratched nameplate, remembering all the times he'd heard those tags jingle during their patrols together. With gentle reverence, he placed the collar on the shelf, positioning it next to a framed photograph. In the picture, Max stood proud and alert on one side, while Echo mirrored the same pose on the other, past and present, linked by an unbreakable bond. The shelf had become a sort of memorial, not of loss, but of continuation. Each item told a story. John Calloway's badge, the mysterious metal disc from Max's collar, and now this, symbols of a legacy that refused to end. A knock at the door broke through the quiet moment. Echo's ears perked up, but he remained calm, sensing no threat. Daniel smiled, knowing who it would be. The newest recruit, right on time for their first training session. As he walked to the door, Daniel caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. Gone was the hardened, isolated officer who had once shunned connection. In his place stood a man who had learned to embrace both loss and love, understanding now that one could not exist without the other. He opened the door, ready to welcome another soul into this extraordinary family of guardians and their chosen partners. With warmth in his voice, Daniel spoke the words that would begin another chapter. Welcome to the family. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Daniel and Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.